Salazar Parrenas, it is a great pleasure to welcome you at the Max Weber program and the UI lecture series. I am Lilian Tsourdi, I am a Max Weber Fellow here in Law.
I am Giulia Bonazza, I am an historian from the History Department. Welcome.
Thank you, I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. You have produced over the years an impressive amount of scholarship, drawing also from robust fieldwork. And while your earlier works focus on gender, sexuality and transnational household formation, there has recently been a shift towards the intersections of human trafficking and labor migration. Could you share with us what motivated this evolution in the focus of your work?
So in the first 10 years of my career, I looked at how gender is constituted in migration, looking at gender's constitution from a multi-scalar perspective. And so I looked at how the political economy of migration is informed by gender, hence my discussion of the international division of reproductive labor, or otherwise the care chain, in which women transfer the reproductive labor activities across borders. And then looking at how it's constituted in the family, and then how it's constituted in gender, how it's constituted in the identity of migrants. But in the last 10 years, I've switched my focus to looking at labor migration and human trafficking. And so this was not an intentional move on my part. I'm primarily interested in labor and migration experiences. And increasingly, labor migrants have been identified as trafficked persons. And while I approach the subject from a labor migration perspective, I have to engage their labeling as trafficked victims. So to give you an example, I had been a visiting professor at Ochanomizu University in Tokyo. And during that time, I had plenty of flexibility to do field work, a new research project on migrant workers in Japan. And because of my access to language and because they were the largest group of Filipino migrant workers in the country, I decided to do a study on hostesses, on migrant hostesses. And I could not avoid talking about trafficking because this is a group that had been labeled by the US Department of State as trafficked victims. And so the project then became a question of how does this identification shape their labor market or labor migration experiences. And then since then, if one is interested in just the migration of domestic workers globally as I am, you cannot avoid but talk about trafficking or even modern day slavery. And it's because migrant domestic workers have become, along with sex workers, the symbol of victims of modern day slavery today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Your analysis on the agency of migrants resonate with the contemporary debate on free labor, the historiographical debate. Do you think it's possible a comparison between the agency of a slave in early modern period and the agency of migrant? And do you think sociologists and historians could collaborate to try to deconstruct this fixed theoretical framework in which we work, so to try to deconstruct the concept of slaves, human trafficking, violence, and propose new alternative on degree of coercion?
So I appreciate your question, and one of the reasons why I appreciate it is because it points to a limitation in my perspective. And so I primarily look at unfree labor in the contemporary period. And so while I have read, should I say extensively, while I have read substantially on historical periods of slavery or historical moments of slavery, I wouldn't claim to be an expert on it. And so I know from my limited reading, which is based primarily from the national context I'm coming from, which is the US, much of slavery is really talking about chattel slavery, and so there is a very uniform definition of slavery. The indentured workers that came to the US from Europe in the 19th century were not considered slaves, right? So I'm just speaking then now of like chattel slavery. And so for me, it's very hard to move away from that in the political context of the US and the experiences of African Americans. But I am unfamiliar with forms of slavery, let's say in South Asia or Southeast Asia or Europe. And so I'm actually unfamiliar whether there is what we could say gradations of unfreedom, right? And so I do think there are gradations of unfreedom in the contemporary period. Maybe the fact that there were people bound in servitude coexisting with people bound in slavery, even in the US context, does tell us that unfreedom is there are gradations of them. But yeah, that's definitely, I think, an interesting lens to pursue, is to do a comparative framework of how various forms of unfreedom like coexist across time.
Coming back to the contemporary debates, and I noted yesterday in your masterclass about your recent fieldwork on Filipino domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates, and the gradation that you mentioned of unfreedom, and this new framework that you have developed on the three cultures of domestic work, dehumanization, infantilization, and recognition. So I was wondering if you could share with us some of the empirical findings that led you to this new construct.
Yes. So my current project is a collaborative one that I'm doing with a geographer, Rhacel Salazar, who's based at the University of Toronto. She's a geographer who is an expert on the migration of Indonesian domestic workers to the Middle East. And we are conducting an ethnographic study on domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates primarily, but we're also comparing that to Singapore. And so the first thing I want to say is that before we came there were a lot of works written that depicted the experiences of migrant domestic workers in that region in a very sort of uniform perspective. The depiction of them was that they were all abused, and that they were nothing but slaves was the sort of perspective that you got. That was one. And then the second perspective that we were getting was that they're inaccessible. And so you really can't access these workers because they are bound to the home, they're bound to their employers, they are probably not going to be released to or given the freedom to be interviewed by you. And so we actually were able to go there and access them quite easily, both Indonesians and Filipinos. And we have about 165 in-depth interviews with domestic workers that were 2 to 3 hours in length. We interviewed employers, we interviewed recruitment agencies. We have a diverse sample of all of them. And so based on our findings, what surprises the most in the context of the public discourse that's out there was that domestic workers in that region face a diversity of labor standards, and that these labor standards vary across households. And so you have some domestic workers with a day off, you have some who do not have a day off, you have domestics whose employers allow them to do part-time work for other households so that they can increase their earnings. You have others who do not allow them to do that. You have some who get paid less than the minimum wage established by the country of origin, and then you have some that make significantly more than what their country of origin is saying should be their base pay. And so we were surprised by the diversity of these experiences. And so one of our tasks as scholars is to not just empirically establish the diversity of these experiences, but to explain why such diversity exists. And so we found that one way to explain this diversity is through this typology we created that you mentioned, that we found 3 predominant cultures of domestic work in the UAE. One is that domestics are dehumanized by their employers, and so that's basically that employers are not seeing them as persons with particular needs, whether it's that they need to eat a certain amount of food to survive, whether it's important for them to communicate with people so that they don't go crazy, or that they need to actually like go outside so they get exposed to sun, so they physically need that. So some employers never consider those basic needs of a human being, so they completely dehumanize their domestic workers. In other cases, domestic workers are given such basic amenities, privileges, but employers don't completely trust them. So employers don't think that they would make good judgment when they go on a day off. The employers don't think that they really know what's good for them health-wise. They don't think that they can, manage their work well without direct supervision. So they infantilize their domestic workers. And so an example would be an employer will monitor the use of the telephone of the domestic worker because they don't trust them to not talk to a boyfriend, or that they'll confiscate the phone at 10 p.m. at night because they don't think that the domestic worker can manage their time and say, I have to be asleep by midnight because I have to be awake by 6 a.m. and work. And so then they just want to make sure that their domestic has 8 hours of sleep. And so that's like an example of infantilization. And then you have one that actually have a respect for the personhood of the domestic worker and just recognize them as adults and accordingly treat them as adults. And so there's a little bit more trust in those households. So they give the domestic worker the phone and know that the domestic worker will just manage their time correctly, and if they lack sleep, then it's on them to suffer throughout that day then, because they had to work X hours with very little sleep. So that's just for us a good way of explaining the diverse standards across households. But we also chose that framework because it really shows the different moral perspectives that employers hold about their domestic worker. And so you have a moral of like a maternalism among those who infantilize them. There's the one of mutual recognition in the ones that recognize them, and then there's the one who basically you could just say they're racist, or that they are think of themselves as just superior to these lesser than individuals.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Moving to your monograph, Illicit Flirtation, which focuses on critical reassessment of hostess in Japan. In the introduction, I was really surprised about your method. That is an anthropological method.
Yes.
So that for a period you work in a hostess club in Tokyo.
Yes.
And so could you tell more about this experience?
Yes.
I think also a personal, important anthropological experience.
Yes. So as a researcher, my goal is to always share the perspective or the experiences of a group of migrant workers from their own perspective. And so I really try to go sort of get really grounded to see how do they see their experiences. And so I think sometimes that gets me into trouble because their perspectives are often or sometimes not politically correct, right? Mm-hmm. And so an example being in Japan, there are many transgender hostesses. And so these are male to female. So in the context of the West, you have to refer to them from a she pronoun. You have to look at them as women, as female. But what was very difficult for me was to recognize their own perspective in which they insisted on being distinguished from all the other women, from the heterosexual women, the cisgender women, and that they did not want their maleness erased, despite their feminine gendered appearance. And as they explained to me, erasing that maleness from which they originated then downplays the extent of work that they've had to do to reach that point. And it fails to recognize the greater struggles and efforts that they have than their quote unquote female counterparts, the she pronoun women. So, and for that reason, they actually also don't want to have a sex change because they said God gave this to them and they don't want to, commit the sin, which, having a sex change versus playing with their gender in their perspective is like not a sin. So, but for a Western gender scholar, I think that's very difficult to swallow, right? Because then it's almost like you are not recognizing them as a gendered, like female or feminine person. So that's just an example of, for me, like I always try to get on the ground to see how they understand their experience. So when I went to Japan, it was very hard to access hostesses. They often were very closed to outsiders. And so your imagination starts going wild because you think, why? Are they trafficked? Are they, held against their will so they can't talk to you openly? Then I realized that to access them, I actually had to work as one. And so I worked as one. And I only worked as one because I already knew from talking to some of them, on the streets briefly, that they don't engage in prostitution. I think for me, my moral boundaries would not allow me to go that far. And so hostessing, I knew, was just flirting and that there was no physical interaction required in the job of flirting. And so then that's why I did it. I wouldn't say that it was an easy job because the job entailed, so if you're a hostess, what you do is you serve men and you flirt with men, and you have to actually embody a position of subservience vis-a-vis men. And as a tenured professor, by the time I started doing that work, it was very hard to act subservient to anyone, And so I had to be, and so, like, I'll give you an example. When a customer, male, enters the club, you all have to say in unison, "Welcome to our club." And then he sits down, but before he sits down, someone is assigned to him who gives him a towel and has to kneel in front of him. Like, so he's seated and you have to kneel and bow and wipe his hand with a hot towel. And then you proceed to like sit with him, ask him if you can sit with him, and then he'll say, "Yes, you can sit with me." And you're like, "Oh, thank you for letting me sit with you." and then you cannot sit on the same level as him. So the hostess had to sit on a step stool. And so that he's in a normal chair and then you're on the step stool. So then you're guaranteed to be lower than him. And as I was doing the job, I learned many other, protocols. One of them being when I toast with the customer, the rim of my glass has to be lower than his because so you really have to show subservience in all of its different capacities and all these minute details, because it could be insulting for him if you're suddenly like putting yourself in a superior, position. That was hard to act subservience, but I was happy I did it because after I did it, I had a very deep understanding of the job. I knew what was required of them. I knew how physically taxing it was. And then more importantly, after I started working as one, every single person I approached to be interviewed finally agreed to do it with no questions. And then I realized that they don't like talking to people who are not familiar with the job because most people who have talked to them who are not familiar with the job, like for example, family friends in the Philippines, have these preconceived notions. So their questions are building from these preconceived notions, and so they found it very annoying that they would have to undo these notions. So it'd be like, do you like sleeping with customers? So then the person was assuming they're sleeping with a customer. So then they were more than happy to be interviewed by me because they knew my questions were not going to be laden with these preconceived notions. So I was very happy to do it. I'm happy I didn't give up after my first 3 months of trying to get them to be interviewed, and no one would agree to be interviewed. And so then I just think that, when people do research among hard to reach populations, it's like very important to be persistent. Because it could happen, like that you can finally get in there if you're just persistent. Yeah.
I can only imagine the challenge as a gender scholar also to have undergone this experience.
Yeah.
But certainly.
Oh yeah, it was funny, and then the women you were with had different tastes. Like, so I had my designer clothes that I spent a lot of money on, and then they would like critique them. And so they all wore these $30 US polyester dresses that you get from like, the sidewalk. And so then it was like, I had to start dressing, I had to buy those dresses to fit into the club. It was like so in terms of my class standing and my gender sort of notions, it was just like, I had to completely suspend them to do this work.
Impressive for the field work. I would like to come back to one of your other monographs, Servants of Globalization, which draws from the second edition, is enhanced and draws from field work in Italy, in Los Angeles, in Denmark, so from several contexts. And where, in fact, it is very intriguing that your findings, rather than a pattern of step migration, point to patterns either of the realities of direct or serial, but you have termed as serial migration. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on the latter concept and on your findings in this setting.
So what I have come to learn from researching migrant domestic workers from the Philippines, in Italy, the US, Singapore, and the United Arab Emirates, so those are very, very diverse countries, is that there is a stratification, not just of destinations, but that stratification of destinations leads to segmented pathways. And so people don't necessarily jump from one destination to another in terms of jump from one destination to a better destination. So to give you an example, someone in Dubai likely does not have a high school degree, grew up in a non-cement structure, didn't have running water, close to illiterate, right? It's very hard for them to make it to Singapore because Singapore requires a high school degree. And then it's near impossible for them to go to Canada because they, in Canada, require 2 years of college. But these near illiterate domestic workers, some of them are literate, some of them are educated, but rarely, can accompany an employer on vacation to Europe and escape and end up undocumented in Europe and hope for an amnesty, right? So, but we have to recognize that the person who escapes from their employer on vacation is exceptional. So that's not, that's not very common. So while you meet many of them here, perhaps, there's a lot more of them left in the Middle East who would never do that and who would never imagine that access. And so I think we have to recognize, because of the different human capital and economic capital of domestic workers that they come in with, that there will be this stratified system. So hence many of them are just direct migrants. And so the people who end up in the US or Italy for that matter had plenty of resources to come here. And so now in Italy, it's mostly family network migration of, domestic workers who came here earlier. It's their family following them. But before, they spent, $10,000 to come here illegally before, and they don't do that so much anymore. A domestic worker in Dubai will never have that kind of money, and if they did have that kind of money, they would rather open up a business in the Philippines than come here, right, and take all this risk. And hence, I think the stepwise migration, you also have to put it in perspective, like the ultimate destination is Canada, right? And the ultimate destination is Canada because in Canada they can acquire permanent residency if they work for one employer for 2 continuous years, and granted they have a 2-year college level of education. But statistically, stepwise migration is not supported because there's about 56,000 Filipino domestic workers who have participated in the live-in caregivers program of Canada since its inception in the 1980s. That's very little, 56,000, considering there at any given moment about 1.4 million Filipino domestic workers globally, right? So stepwise migration, yes, exists. Many of the 56,000 who ended up in Canada had worked elsewhere prior, but I would say that is just one of different types of migration pathways. I think more than stepwise migration, you see more commonly what we call serial migration, and that is, there's not much logic or rational thought to people when they decide where to go, but they're very agency dependent. They go back to the Philippines after their contract ends in one country. They go to the agency and say, I want to go abroad again, and the agency say, well, there's openings in Saudi Arabia. And then they'll go to Saudi Arabia, work there for a few years, maybe they'll renew a contract, and then they don't want to be there anymore. They go back to the Philippines, then they go back to the agency. You might say, I want to go to Saudi Arabia. I like my employer there. It's like, sorry, there's no openings in Saudi Arabia. You can go to Jordan, right? And so a lot of times what you see increasingly now with the institutionalization of migration is that agencies and not networks determine destinations. That's one thing. You see a high degree of risk aversion. That means domestic workers are not wanting to pay a lot of money to leave the country, so they'll end up going to these destinations like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and so then that's why we call it serial migration. It's because there's no mobility in destination, and it's not like, oh, go to Jordan because you'll make more money than you do in Saudi Arabia. So that's what we found, and so we found like for the Filipinos, we interviewed 50% were serial migrants, so they had been hopping from one country to the next, and about 90% of our Indonesian domestic workers were like that, primarily going to Saudi and UAE. Yeah.
So, in conclusion, the last question is more general on the role of the state.
Okay.
So, why Philippines maybe control or not control this external migration? There is profitability for the state, maybe double agreement with some state or not.
Yeah.
And maybe to add, on the field, if you have found that this enhanced role that the state plays, does it empower more the Filipino domestic workers compared to domestic workers from other nationalities or not?
Yeah. So I do think that so there's plenty of migrant sending nations, not just the Philippines, with its robust policies. You could argue so is Indonesia, so is Bangladesh, so is so the Philippines, Bangladesh, India. They send out a lot of workers primarily to the Middle East. And those countries have different management policies when it comes to out-migration. The ones that have been more systematic and just institutionalized is the Philippines, followed by Indonesia. But so those are the states that have a recruitment program, right? So it's a more institutionalized, but you have to remember that there are also states that manage their citizens abroad, but those citizens migrate without any management of the state. And so I'm thinking here of Haiti and Mexico. And so while these countries don't have these emigration policy schemes, their people still out-migrate. And what's interesting is they actually have programs to assist those citizens, especially when they return. And so, for example, in Haiti, they even have that, like, elected officials that represent migrant workers. And so it's in different capacities, states try to recognize that their citizens are outside the country, right? So in the case of the Philippines, they do have this robust program of assisting migrants in their emigration process. My colleague Robin Rodriguez is very critical of this program, and she thinks of it as nothing but the constitution of what she calls a labor exporting state, in which workers are just completely commodified. I think that perspective does not take into account the social contract that state does try to maintain with its citizens, and that the state actually has plenty of protectionist schemes. And these protectionist schemes go from setting up bilateral policies with nations to set up like labor standards. They include banning out-migration to particular destinations. So for example, at some point they banned migration to Norway and Denmark because they found au pairs to be really oppressed. Right now they don't allow them to go to Syria or Libya, understandably. And then they also have this program in which they have them do this pre-departure orientation seminar. Then they have this other program where they require them to go through to recruitment agencies. And then this last program that they have is, if you don't go through a recruitment agency and you try to leave the Philippines as a tourist because you have a sister, let's say in Italy, who's going to give you a job, even as an undocumented worker, they actually literally offload you from the plane. And so that's the program of offloading is what it's called. And then on average, they offload 40 people per day. And so then, you can argue if they were just an exporting country, they would not be offloading anyone from that airplane. Yeah. But every day they offload about 40 people, and that's an anti-trafficking stance they've taken, because they think if people leave as undocumented workers or potentially undocumented workers, they become potential trafficking victims. So I just want to say that sending states have a very complicated relationship to its citizenry that it deploys. I don't think they just commodify them. I do think that by promoting out-migration, they are easing the burdens of their social responsibility to their citizens, because then social welfare that they have to provide is lessened by the out-migration of workers, right? So I think that's definitely like one motivating factor for promoting migration. But at the same time, I think it's doesn't mean that they've abdicated themselves of complete responsibility for the well-being of such workers.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much for
our
interesting discussions, and we very much look forward to your lecture this afternoon.
Okay.